Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. I think we have some, let's see, more than 70 people on the line already, and more will be joining in the coming minutes. So I think we are ready to kick off because we have 1 hour and 30 minutes time for us. The event is titled EU Sanctions Policy for a Geopolitical Era, and it's organized to mark the publication of the study commissioned by the government of Finland on the development of EU sanctions policy, political and economic implications for Finland. We've got high attendance today, about 110 people already on the line. Let's see. No, it's 70 currently, but we are expecting more than 100 people to join. I'm happy to note this because dissemination of the results, reach out, are key parts of this kind of research project, of course. We'll first hear the presentations and then have the questions answered in the end. And I hope the Q&A session will take about 40 minutes. In the seminar, we are going to hear presentations from the government's point of view, starting with Under Secretary of State Kai Sauer. The main thing will be, of course, to hear the presentations about the results of the research, and these will be given by Program Director Juha Jokela from FIIA, Senior Analyst Clara Portela from EUISS, and researcher Birgitta Berg-Andersson from ETLA Economic Research. After these 3 presentations on the results of the research, we'll have comments from Senior Advisor Solanko from the Bank of Finland and myself. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Under Secretary of State from the Foreign Ministry of Finland, Kai Sauer. He is also the former permanent representative of Finland to the United Nations and currently the chairman of the board of FIIA. Kai, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Juha, and congratulations to both Juhas for attracting such an impressive a group of participants representing so many interest groups and many friends and highly regarded experts and professionals among them. You referred to my background in the UN, and that sort of reminded me of the role Finland played during its previous term at the UN Security Council. It's a long time ago, unfortunately long. In 1989, 1990, Finland was actually chairing the Iraq sanctions committee, and that has somehow, I think, also determined our thinking on these issues. But let me give you some general remarks, and starting with explaining a little bit about the background of this research project, which is one project among several which the government commissions every year. And of course, the aim of these reports is to feed into the government's policy work, and in this case, more directly in the foreign ministry's work. Normally, a couple of projects are launched every year, and the preparations of the sanctions project, which is to be published and discussed today, started already 2 years ago in 2018. And it is in place to congratulate the whole research team, the Finnish Institute of International Affairs and the ETLA, the economic research body, for their excellent work. And I'm very pleased to see Juha Rainne, my close collaborator, chairing this event, since he has been also chairing the work of the the research group. I would like to highlight 3 elements which are recent developments impacting the sanctions landscape. First, since 2014, the sanctions imposed by the European Union against Russia have changed our environment quite significantly. The economic implications are bigger than all previous sanctions regimes. They also manifest the immediate national interest of Finland within the general sanctions policy. However, it must be noted that the sanctions imposed by the European Union have not greatly influenced the Finnish economy as a whole. We have consistently supported the EU sanctions. Russia's actions in Ukraine were a breach of international law and needed to followed by consequences. The implementation of the Minsk agreements is a condition for the removal of the economic sanctions. At the same time, we have underlined that the dialogue and cooperation with Russia needs to continue when it is in our interest and the EU's interest. Secondly, there has been a change in the sanctions policy of the United States that we must understand. Recently, the United States has resorted to a stronger sanctions policy, which includes more unilateral action and which often has extraterritorial effects. The US unilateral course of action is most visible with Iran, where its strategy of maximum pressure includes tough sanctions. But also the dynamics in the US-Russia sanctions policy have changed. In the beginning, referring to 2014 and Crimea, here the EU-US sanctions policies against Russia were very similar with the European Union, but now the US has imposed stronger sanctions, not always followed by the European Union. As the US has intensified its sanctions policy, its extraterritorial effects have indeed become more visible, and they are especially felt in Europe because we have strong economic links with the US, and at the same time with the targeted economies such as Russia and to a certain extent also Iran. So to respond to these challenges, the EU countries maintain close contacts with our counterparts in Washington in order to explain our point of view and to coordinate sanctions policy to the extent possible. Besides, there are attempts to create mechanisms to address these US-induced challenges, such as the INSTEX in connection of Iran, which is a mechanism to facilitate humanitarian trade. And thirdly, in my brief, this has been put in brackets, but I think this is a very important point. Thirdly, there's Brexit. The UK's withdrawal from the European Union means, of course, that in the future we in the EU must coordinate our sanctions closer with the UK. UK has been a very strong actor in the sanctions field. They have accumulated strong institutional knowledge, which has, in the period when UK was still the EU member, has helped the EU to promote its sanctions policy. So on that basis, it is in the interest of the European Union to continue coordinating its sanctions policies with the UK also in the future. So all in all, sanctions are a topic that require our increased attention. They seem to be a widely used tool in the times of increasing geo-economic competition which we are witnessing. And of course, they have also direct impact on our national interest. We are a relatively small and very much export-oriented economy. So if sanctions are overused with the aim, for example, to advance protectionist policies, everybody would suffer, and we in particular. But on the other hand, we are also very dependent on the rules-based international order. Sanctions are a key tool to react to severe violations of international norms and to promote compliance with international law. And therefore, we see the value of determined but carefully considered, calibrated EU sanctions policy. To finish, I think we can't have a meeting without referring to the coronavirus and its implications. The pandemic could have long-lasting implications to the foreign and security environment. This is a very concrete topic to myself and to us at the Foreign Ministry and broader who work in preparing the government's white paper on foreign and security policy, in Finnish, ulko- ja turvallisuuspoliittinen selonteko. And because of the coronavirus, we have also decided, well, we were instructed to postpone our work on this report in order to make a more educated assessment on the implications. So we are planning to publish or hand over our report to the Parliament only in the autumn. So also in this seminar, probably the coronavirus and its implications on sanctions will be discussed, as some countries, with Russia at the forefront, some countries who are targeted by sanctions have advocated for the suspension of sanctions due to the health crisis. And the response has been that sanctions will not be lifted because of corona. First, because the sanctions are not covering humanitarian aid anyway. And then secondly, the conditions for lifting the sanctions must be first fulfilled. So with this semi-brief introduction, I wish we will have a good discussion and bringing some new ideas which then can also be used in our foreign policy designation. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator.
Next, I would like to give the floor to Juha Jokela, under whose supervision the research work has been carried out. He'll start the following 3 presentations about the findings of the study, and he is the program director at FIIA. Please, Juha, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and thank you very much also for Undersecretary of State Kai Sauer for your excellent opening remarks for this project. In my presentation, my idea is also to touch upon the challenges which you already mentioned for the EU sanctions policy, and also provide some options for the EU and its member states to face and respond to those challenges. Dr. Clara Portela will then zoom in more into the parts of the research where we address how the EU could address or respond to these challenges in terms of developing its decision-making and implementation of its sanctions policy. But before going into the challenges, I would perhaps first like to mention a couple of words, or say a couple of words related to the background of the project and its objective, and also the very project itself, because the report, which has been a couple of minutes ago published by the Prime Minister's office, is indeed reflecting a broader research project in which several important interlocutors and researchers have played a role. So first of all, of course, this was a collaboration between FIIA and ETLA economic research, and this was a very interesting exercise to combine both the political analysis side of it as well as the economic analysis. We have also been able to include external experts like Clara Portela in the research, and we have benefited a lot from different types of brainstorming, also the very active participation of the steering group chaired by Juha Rainne. I also want to mention the discussions we have had with the EU Council RELEX working group and the sanctions formation. And this, during the Finnish EU Council presidency, provided us as an opportunity to do some semi-structured interviews on a confidential nature with the officials. And I have just been briefing 2 hours ago the Council's RELEX sanctions formation again about the key outcomes of this project. So the interest has carried over also beyond the Finnish Council presidency. I also have to note that the report is edited by my colleagues Niklas Helvig and Clara Portela, and it's the contribution of researchers Ilari Aula, Birgitta Berg-Andersson, Markku Lehmus, Matti Pesu and Ville Sinkkonen are an integral part of this report. If we would have had a proper seminar in the Parliament building, for instance, we would of course have more speakers for this event, and I hope we will have a possibility to do that in due course. So in terms of the background, what Kai Sauer was already mentioning, perhaps a couple of words about the objectives of the project, because it's important to state what we aim to do. So then when you read the report, you can evaluate how well we have managed to do that. So we aim to analyze the development of EU sanctions policy in general and the impact of these new dynamics, which were already described in the opening remarks in particular. And in addition to that, our task was also to assess the political and economic implications for Finland. That's of course obvious because this research was commissioned by the government of Finland. We were also encouraged to discuss options for the EU and Finland and even present some recommendations. And when we move into the challenges of EU sanctions policy, the more unilateral and also unpredictable US sanctions policy was already mentioned and elaborated. What I would like to do here is perhaps to underline the coordination between US and EU as the kind of the central element of these two most prominent sanction cases of the past decade. That is the Iran nuclear program and the Ukraine crisis. And I think this is a really key challenge for the EU now when the coordination is not on the same levels as it used to be. Because the broader question about the effectiveness of sanctions tools is of course relevant for this study and all the discussion for the foreign policy in general. And I think in these two cases, we can clearly see that the sanctions have worked as a part of a broader diplomatic efforts. In Iran case, the EU 3+3 format leading to the temporary resolution of the dispute, and then of course the Normandy format in terms of the Ukraine crisis. And now, of course, the EU is in a completely new setting where the coordination between the US and EU action is not sort of something what can be relied on. I think it's also important to note that the unilateral applications of US sanctions is something which is very much which very much describes the current US administration's preference to address the increasing great power competition. And also the impact of secondary sanctions was already mentioned. Here I would mention that, of course, we have seen the US using unilateral sanctions already before this current administration, But what the research in the report suggests that this is a very preferred way of working for the current administration. And in this sense, of course, the key question what we cannot answer yet is that what will happen in the US presidential elections and what will be the preferred way of operating of the new administration. The research and the report also looks into the very interesting question related to the dynamics in Washington, and this is between the Congress and the White House over sanctions. And the argument is that this wrangling between these two key institutions in US sanctions policy leads to a rather volatile sanctions environment. So the unilateral dimension is there, but it's also that the US sanctions policy has become more unpredictable, and this poses or increases the level of challenge for the EU. The report suggests that to respond to this challenge, the EU and its member states should strive for perhaps even stronger unified positions in terms of the sanctions policy, and these positions should clarify very clearly the European interests and values that the Europeans want to uphold. And we also suggest that the diplomatic efforts in Washington, we know that they are already taking place, could however be strengthened. And here we suggest that perhaps the EU diplomats under unified message should look increasingly towards the Congress and also towards the broader policy community in Washington, the lobby groups as well as the think tank community. And indeed, there is need to intensify the efforts to build shield against the secondary sanctions. I think this is something which is now related to the US, but the research also suggests that in future other actors might also adopt secondary sanctions which are relevant for the EU and the European businesses. And in this slide, the research also aims to connect this shield to the broader discussion of EU's foreign policy, and also the geo-economic or geo-economic commission. As sanctions tool is only part of the response, I think this requires also more broadly response to the use of secondary sanctions. Now the challenges related to the Brexit, very briefly, this is of course something which has already happened. And the fact is that the EU has now lost one of the most active and influential member states in EU sanctions policy making. And this is a tremendous loss because the EU has provided both the technical expertise and also political leadership in these major sanctions decisions, which is very much needed in the EU decision making on sanctions. And now the Brexit means that the UK is out of the EU policy planning and also the policy making structures. What is, I think, very important to note is that currently the UK is not interested in an institutionalized relationship with the EU in foreign and security policy matters. This is what Boris Johnson's government has suggested, and so far the UK has not engaged, even if the EU negotiators have tabled a draft treaty on this matter in the negotiations related to EU and UK future relations. So the possibility to mitigate the impact of Brexit for EU sanctions appears to be at the moment rather limited. Of course, we don't know how the situation will evolve. For instance, if a future relations agreement is concluded and ratified, but potentially there will be a possibility to move to that direction in due course. This points to the kind of the conclusions that the EU and its member states should really build rapidly the technical expertise to facilitate decision making. And there are several fields where the UK expertise and the loss of it is known, and these are the ones where the EU should concentrate on. And also we suggest that the other member states should step in to provide political leadership for sanctions decisions in the EU system. And of course, the major member states, Germany and France, are the key here. But we also see that there is room for smaller member states, mid-sized member states, to become leaders in certain fields of sanctions policy making. And for a smaller member state, I would argue that it is crucial to try to establish a more institutional EU-UK mechanism for sanctions coordination. Because if the sanctions are in the future in Europe coordinated among the key capitals, Berlin, Paris, and London, in an informal and ad hoc format. So this, of course, poses a challenge for a smaller membership to have an access to this coordination at the early stage of planning. But I have used my time and a little bit more of it. I'm very sorry of that, and I will now stop here and pass the floor back to Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Jokela. Next, I would like to give the floor to Clara Portela, who is Senior Analyst from the EU Institute for Security Studies and one of the co-editors of the final report. Please.
Thank you very much. So following up on what Juha has just explained, I'm going to talk very briefly about 3 points. So the first point is decision making, the second point will be implementation and enforcement of EU sanctions, and finally I will allude briefly to the need for a broader strategic discussion on these topics. So first of all, decision making is subdivided into 2 steps. So actually it is a bit more complex in this field than in other fields of EU action. So the decision-making process is subdivided into 2 steps. First, a Council decision is necessary in order to establish the political decision for the adoption of sanctions, and following that, if the measures adopted have implications for the common market, a follow-up regulation will be necessary. So the most important out of these 2 documents, 2 pieces of legislation, is obviously the Council decision establishing the sanctions, and this document is adopted by unanimity. So the big question is whether these documents should continue to be adopted by unanimity, or whether it could be adopted using qualified majority voting. Actually, a number of important figures have, such as, for example, the current High Representative, Josep Borrell, have advocated the use of qualified majority voting. And obviously, the advantage of adopting sanctions legislation using qualified majority voting would be that the incentives for member states would be modified. Member states would have a stronger incentive to look for consensus out of the fear of being outvoted, and we would witness fewer and fewer cases in which sanctions decisions are blocked because one member state vetoes the adoption or the renewal of the measures. However, there are still advantages about keeping the current unanimity system. In case that we adopted the qualified majority voting system, this would increase inhibitions of member states to agree to sanctions in the first place, because they might, they would fear a situation in which they cannot stop measures that that basically affect negatively their economies. So our recommendation here is to advocate a limited increase of qualified majority voting, basically expanding it in a limited fashion, but keeping unanimity as the main decision-making procedure. My second point concerns the implementation and enforcement of sanctions. So here, in contrast to what we have seen with decision-making, which is centralized in the Brussels institutions, implementation and enforcement is actually decentralized, so that these aspects of sanctions policy remain in the hands of national authorities. So this means that it is national authorities which make decisions on granting exceptions or determining penalties for sanctions violations. So obviously this situation creates a risk of discrepancies in how each national authority reads, interprets, and implements these responsibilities. So the Commission is obviously competent to monitor these developments, and the Commission also has the possibility of launching an infringement procedure in case that any major violation is detected. However, the Commission will only act in cases of obvious violations or of very blatant discrepancies between member states. So, basically, this system has been like this from the very start, but there might be now a reason to review it, precisely because as the EU is now increasingly imposing sanctions which have economic repercussions for domestic actors, these domestic industries are paying more attention to uniform implementation throughout the EU. So our recommendation consists in increasing the monitoring powers of the Commission in order to promote a more uniform implementation throughout the EU, and in parallel, increase capacities for sanctions design, so that both at the level of the national authorities and at the level of the EU institutions, we have better expertise and a sufficient number of professionals to ensure this uniform implementation. So my final point refers to a less technical aspect. Basically, our finding here is that upgrading capacity is part of the story, but it is not the whole story. We have witnessed disquieting developments in US sanctions policy that have been alluded to by Sauer at the beginning of the session. We have also witnessed the British withdrawal, which, as explained by Juha Jokela, also has profound implications for the future of sanctions policy. And this obviously creates the need for a broader discussion on the future prospects of sanctions as an EU foreign policy instrument. What is interesting here is that the UK has been discussing since the referendum what its sanctions policy will look like after Brexit. But on the other side of the channel, in continental Europe, we haven't had such discussion so far. And in view of the fact that the sanctions landscape is becoming increasingly complex, we should contemplate having an intra-European debate on the mid and long-term perspectives of the strategic employment of this tool. When, where, and how should the EU deploy sanctions? And when is it better not to do it? I mean, we are talking about the increasingly sophisticated use of this tool by the EU as an inherently positive development. But perhaps it would be better for the EU to be more selective and to think through when to employ sanctions and when to refrain from doing so. And what sort of relationship should the EU sanctions policy have vis-a-vis measures by other actors such as the United Nations, Canada, which is an increasingly close partner, the UK, obviously, the US? How should the instrument be adapted to the increasingly competitive geo-economic environment? So this debate should be informed by strategic priorities and ideally also be complemented by insights from research. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Next, I would like to give the floor to Birgitta Berg-Andersson, researcher from the ETLA Economic Research. She will present the chapter of the research focusing on the economic impact of the Russia sanctions. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. As Juha Rainne already said, I will present the economic part of the report. Here we have the black line shows total world exports to Russia. It's the left scale, and the yellow line shows total exports to Russia, excluding goods that were sanctioned by EU. And the top 5 exporters to Russia are China, Germany, USA, Ukraine, and Belarus. And the blue line shows the exports of goods sanctioned by the EU. And you can see that in the year 2011, the export was at its highest level, and it was around 3.5 billion euros. And you can also see from the line that the exports declined already before the sanctions were put in 2014. And the top 5 exporters of these sanctioned goods are Ukraine, China, South Korea, Germany, and the USA. And at the bottom, you can see a red line. It's exports of arms to Russia from the whole world. Here we have the exports of counter-sanctioned goods, the blue line. And you can see that it follows quite near the line for the total exports. And it was at its highest level in 2013, and then it was around 17 billion euros. And the top 5 exporters of these counter-sanctioned goods are Brazil, Belarus, Turkey, USA, and China. And in the report, we have estimated the effects of sanction by calculating the share of sanctioned goods of total commodity exports to Russia for every country. And we have done this both for the goods sanctioned by EU and the counter-sanctioned goods, that is import restricted by Russia. I will also tell you something about previous research results. Russian imports declined notably in 2014 to 2016 as a result of falling demand and a sharp ruble depreciation. And that is what you can see here in the figure, the drop in the years 2014, 15, and 16. In another report, they have calculated that falling oil prices explained 80% of the decline in Russia's GDP and import demand, and that very little was left to be explained by sanctions or other factors. And this is in line with research results from the IMF. Low oil prices reduced the Russia GDP growth rate by 0.7 percentage points per year in the period 2014 to 2018, but sanctions reduced the growth rate only by 0.2 percentage points. And in another report, they have concluded that counter-sanctions resulted in increased domestic prices, declining consumption, and increased domestic production. It is also important to notice that Russia's counter-sanctions have become part of its general import substitution policies. And there are also some research about trade flows. that says that Russia has switched to imports from non-banned countries also for the non-banned products, not only for the banned. And the results in a research report from Ahn and Ludima says that sanctions and counter-sanctions have had quite a small effect on the exports of most EU countries. But the number of destination markets for EU exporters have increased after the Russian food ban. But at the same time, losses in EU exports to Russia have been very hard to compensate by exports to other markets. It's only some exports to the African continent and China has increased, but generally it has been very difficult to find new markets. And there's also a research report that says that sanctions and counter-sanctions have reduced the foreign direct investment inflows to Russia. And here we have some figures from our report. If you look at the column for the period 2001 to 2014, we can see that the total world exports of EU sanctioned goods to Russia calculated as a share of total exports of goods to Russia was only 1% during that whole period. And for EU, we have that exports of those EU sanctioned goods as a share of total exports of goods to Russia was only 0.28%. And for the countries Ukraine, USA, Japan, Canada, and Australia, the share was in total 0.4%. So these numbers are quite small. Then we can look at the exports of counter-sanctioned goods to Russia. And there we see that the exports from the whole world of counter-sanctioned goods to Russia in relation to total world exports of all goods to Russia was 7.2%, which is much more than for the EU sanctioned goods. And for the EU as a whole, the exports of counter-sanctioned goods to Russia in relation to total exports of goods to Russia was 2.1%. And then we have these other Western countries which also accompanied EU. These countries, USA, Canada, Norway, Switzerland, Iceland, Albania, Australia, and New Zealand. Russia also put the ban on these countries because they were at the same line as the EU in the EU sanctions. And for these countries, USA, Canada, and so on, the share was 1.1%. And the share of total EU exports to Russia when it regards counter-sanctioned goods was 4.8%. And that means that the EU countries have lost a market share of almost 5% in total. And when it comes to the EU sanctioned goods, EU countries have only lost a market share which is below 1%. So from these figures, we can see that the effects of the counter-sanctioned goods, the effects of the ban on counter-sanctioned goods have been much more greater than the effect of EU sanctioned goods. And last, I have here some conclusions from the study. If we first look at the EU's trade sanctions, we have concluded that they had the greatest impact of the economies of Ukraine, the United States, Japan, France, Australia, and Latvia. And we could also conclude that Finland has suffered less from the EU trade sanctions than the rest of the world on average. And then we look at what has the effect of the counter sanctions been. The share of import restricted foodstuffs of total exports to Russia was more than 20% in Iceland, Norway, Greece, Canada, Denmark, Australia, and Lithuania. And this means that counter sanctions have the greatest negative effect on these countries. And at the same time, the countries with the smallest shares of import restricted foodstuffs have suffered the least from Russia's import restrictions when we look at it on the country level. And these countries are Ukraine, Finland, France, Germany, and Italy. And for Finland, I can say that the share of food exports to Russia is quite low when you look at total exports of goods from Finland, but the share of Finland's exports to Russia in the food industry has been very high. It was about 1/3 before the restrictions. And the Finnish dairy industry has been hit very, very hard by these sanctions, although Finland on the country level not has suffered so much. Thank you very much.
I would like to give the floor to Laura Solanko. And here we also start our commentary section of our program today. So the last presentations were about the results of the study, and Laura Solanko is from the Bank of Finland, senior advisor. So she was not part of the research team, but knows of the results of the report. So please, Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the organizers for giving me an opportunity to join the discussion. As all the previous presenters rightly underlined, the sanctions have become an integral part of EU foreign policies. But sort of, however, there's still lots of or a wide disagreement in economic literature on the effects and effectiveness of sanctions. Partly this has to do with the fact that sanctions have changed quite a bit over the last 2 decades or so. As the previous speakers mentioned, first, if sanctions in the past used to be a multilateral instrument backed by a shared vision of world order, they now clearly have become more of an instrument used to serve interests of the sanctioning state. And at the same time, the sanctions are increasingly designed to inflict pain in narrow sectors or narrow activities instead of using economy-wide restrictions. And these so-called smart sanctions aim to minimize the consequences on unsanctioned sectors, including the general population in the targeted country. And therefore, both of these phenomena are well examined in the report and come up in the discussion in several occasions. But the uncertainty about the economic effects of sanctions has also a lot to do with the fact that not all sanction regimes are the same. And I think this was very well came out in the presentation that Birgitta Berg-Andersson just gave us on the various effects and various measures of the EU-Russia and Russia-EU sanctions. If I may, I'd like to bring up 4 features of sanctions that actually do matter when we think about the economic effects. They are first imports versus exports, narrow or broad, retrospective or not, and trade in goods or trade in services and finance. First, restrictions may apply to either exports to the target country or imports from the target. And as you all know, EU has targeted exports, whereas Russia has targeted imports. Now then, is it possible that imports are actually easier to control or verify? Most probably yes, wouldn't know. But in any case, import and export restrictions do create different lobby groups inside the sanctioning countries. Imposing import restrictions is likely to create domestic industry lobby groups for sanctions to remain, whereas export restrictions are likely to create domestic lobby groups for removing the sanctions. And I think this is something we have observed during the past couple of years, both inside the EU and Russia. Second, restrictions may apply to very, very narrow or somewhat broader product categories. EU tries to target fairly narrow set of goods and services, whereas Russia's import restrictions have a somewhat more broad classifications that typically more largely those are given at 4-digit level foreign trade codes. In a narrow list, it may be easier to reclassify products to non-sanctioned goods or to find close substitutes in non-sanctioned goods, and that may have an effect or have an effect on the final influence. Then third, some sanctions, like the EU ones, allow for shipments related to agreements concluded before sanctions, while some do not. There may be many reasons for doing this, but at least, if nothing else, this means that some trade restrictions require years to become visible in trade statistics, whereas some others are visible from the day one. And this might influence the way we perceive, how we perceive sanctions. And then lastly, trade in services is notoriously difficult to register. And there's no equivalent of global trade data for trade in services. And for this reason, the effects of restrictions on services are much more difficult to assess. Restrictions on export of services from the EU may in fact have a huge impact on Russian oil and gas sectors. But this effect is impossible to quantify. And further, quantifying the effects of financial sanctions entail additional complexities, as even narrowly targeted financial sanctions tend to increase funding costs also for non-sanctioned sectors and actors. Once again, limited access to capital markets may have devastating effects on many firms, but exactly quantifying that harm is practically impossible. So these four features do actually have a role and do sort of show up in the discussions when we try to quantify and measure the effects of sanctions. And I think this report provides a very timely and excellent basis for further discussion also on these topics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. And also thank you to all the previous speakers. I will, before finally proceeding into the questions and answers, make some brief comments from my side on the policy point of view of the research. I think the final report is an analytical, balanced, in-depth study on a very timely issue. And I wanted to take up three issues which I found very interesting in the final report, namely the use of qualified majority voting in the EU to decide on sanctions, then the more unilateral and stronger US sanctions policy, and finally the implications of Brexit. These have been touched on in the previous presentations, and I will be brief in order to save time for the questions and answers session. First, the issue of QMV, namely the qualified majority voting. The Commission proposed in 2018 to use the QMV in 3 fields in the EU's common foreign and security policy, and one of them was sanctions. From the early stages of this debate, Finland has been supportive of the idea, namely that in order to improve the efficiency of EU's foreign policy, we should resort to the QMV in certain limited fields. And the rationale behind the Finnish position, and the same goes for the Commission's proposal, is that the majority decision-making would improve the EU's ability to act clearly and on time. And this, in turn, would increase the credibility of EU in the international arena, which again is fully in line with the long-standing Finnish position. It is clear that there is a lot of hesitation towards this idea in the EU, and many EU countries are not supportive. However, the debate goes on. So it's good that the report looks properly on the different aspects related to this proposal. And the report points out obviously very well the facts that are supportive for the idea of adding QMV, including more efficient decision-making, more credible EU foreign policy. But there are also doubts, such as how to guarantee consistent implementation of a decision that was not unanimous in the first place. The report points out that the QMV would mean that the member states lose their full ownership and control of the sanctions. Thus, they could become more cautious about the sanctions policy in general, since they cannot control it in the end. On the other hand, the counter argument goes, the QMV could change the negotiation dynamics in the EU for the better, because faced with a possibility of being outvoted, member state would actually engage in the negotiations for new sanctions, even more than today, and gain thus better ownership. By balancing these different aspects, the plus and minus, the study proposes a careful approach, namely a limited gradual expansion of the qualified majority voting, which would first be used mostly in the less controversial sanctions regimes, and perhaps then step by step taken into a broader use. As the study puts it, this could contribute to a voting culture less dominated by the unanimity reflex. Perhaps this is the realistic way for the EU to go forward as well. My second point was relating to the United States sanctions policy and the different aspects of its development in the recent years, because, as discussed earlier, the US has taken more unilateral sanctions. It has increased, or the internal dynamics in Washington have changed in a way that there is an increased role for the Congress to legislate on new sanctions laws, especially targeting Russia, with a bipartisan support. And then there is the aspect of extraterritorial impact of the United States sanctions. I'm not going to go into much detail in this issue now because it was very thoroughly discussed in the previous presentations, but just to point that the US sanctions policy and its changes in the recent years have been one of the most interesting topics to be discussed. And if we have time, it would be nice to hear from the research team. Perhaps Juha, Jokela or Ville Sinkkonen can discuss how they believe the US sanctions policy can evolve in the future. Can they continue on this path that they've taken now? And how could the United States presidential elections in November perhaps impact US sanctions policy? Finally, the issue of Brexit that is interesting, and more generally the issue of EU-UK relations of the Brexit, as is reflected in form of the sanctions policy. One key question there is to what extent the UK has an interest to diverge from EU sanctions policy, and on the contrary, to what extent it will want to follow the EU sanctions policy in the future. And some argue that by taking a distance from the EU sanctions policy, the UK could signal an independent, sovereign foreign policy. But one can also argue that only acting together with others, the UK can have an effective sanctions policy and meaningful impact on the targeted states. And also in this question, I think the study takes a balanced approach. But if I had to guess, I would say that quite a decisive issue could be the pragmatic business interests. Because if the UK were to largely diverge from the EU sanctions, this would create bureaucratic costs for the companies. And therefore, based on the study at hand, it seems unlikely to me that the UK would adopt truly sovereign sanctions that are different from the EU or United States measures and which have a meaningful economic impact. They can do some small adjustment, but to go completely on their, or in a large way, in their own way, independent way, really sovereign way, I think it's not especially likely scenario. But obviously this remains to be seen. In any case, both the EU and UK would benefit from a close coordination mechanism regarding sanctions, as pointed out in Juha Jokela's presentation. So these were the 3 points I wanted to raise from my side, and we have some 20 and more minutes for the Q&A session. I have noted down 3 questions from the chat box. And I think one of them was already answered also in the chat box, that was relating to an ICG report concerning a more flexible approach to the sanctions against Russia related to Ukraine. This question was, let's say, I understand, addressed in the chat box. But there are 2 other questions. One of them was from Petri Vuorio about the great power competition, about the fact that the discussion is mostly about the United States extraterritorial sanctions at the moment, but it is a possibility that soon China will also legislate, for example, export control laws that are more extraterritorial in their impact, or perhaps one day China might also impose outright sanctions measures similar to, let's say, the US measures, which have similar or try to have similar extraterritorial impact. And what's the EU's response to China-US decoupling? I think this goes to Juha Jokela also. Juha Jokela could start answering by answering Arto Haapea's question about technical capabilities of the EU after Brexit, including intelligence capabilities and EU's potential for an independent EU sanctions policy. So at least these 2 questions. Let's see then if anybody else from the panel wants to have the floor. Please indicate that in the chat box. And also then Juha could give the floor further to Ville Sinkkonen on the question related to the future of the US sanctions policy.
Thank you very much, Juha. And I could actually take the question on the possibility for the independent EU sanctions policy, and of course the others can chip in as well. I was wondering, I think Niklas Helvig could be the one who could discuss the decoupling effect between China and the rest, because he's also focusing on this very much in his current project, which looks at the strategic autonomy discussion in the EU. And then, of course, if Ville could intervene in terms of the US. But the possibility of an independent EU sanctions policy, and also what would be the role of the smaller member states such as Finland in that, I think it's a very pertinent one. And what we actually suggest in this report is that what is kind of urgently needed is an upgrade at the EU level as well as at the national level. And this is also playing into our analysis, what Juha Rainne described, very careful analysis about the qualified majority voting. And the key element there is that keeping the ownership of the member states, which is highly important, especially for a major sanctions decision, the unitary EU action towards major foreign policy, security policy issues. So this means that, of course, it would be perhaps more cost efficient to develop these capacities for independent, truly independent EU sanctions policy in Brussels and in the institutions. The Commission plays a key role here, the External Action Service, and of course the Council decision-making system. And this is, of course, something when one look at the economic prospects caused by the COVID crisis, also is, of course, something that the member states might see as a very beneficial way. But at the same time, and I think this report is also, and the project that the government has funded is a kind of an example of that the smaller members could be also interested in, and they could benefit from developing their capacities to first understand what goes on in the EU decision making and how the sanctions are designed and where are the points in which to intervene and also influence the decision making. Perhaps also developing a certain fields of expertise, sort of division of labor in the Council among the member states or the groups of member states on certain affairs, which could all then, if this is going to the same direction, feed into the possibility of retaining an independent EU sanctions policy. Of course, the sanctions policy, if we look at then in more broadly terms, and this is something what Juha Rainne also mentioned, that we have to look when we discuss the sanctions. I think this is the fact where the economic size really matters. So the divergence of UK from the EU sanctions policy, it is truly an open question. Also for, one could say, for the US foreign policy objectives, especially if some of those at least align with the European interest. So of course this Western unity coordination is an element. But in this world of geopolitical competition and the kind of the EU's more broader aspiration to foster strategic economy more broadly than in the field of defense, I'm talking here foreign policy, the geo-economic commission, its policies. Obviously, EU is a player in the fields of sanctions as well. Its markets are there, and that gives it the leverage. So I see there are prospects for independent sanctions policy also in the future, although the context, of course, is more challenging. But now perhaps for Niklas, if you are online, maybe you want to touch upon the question related to the China.
Yeah, most definitely. Thank you, Juha, for giving me the floor. I'm a leading researcher here at FIIA and also one of the co-editors of the present study. And we also just launched a research project at FIIA looking at European strategic autonomy, also in the field of geo-economics. So the question of great power relations and the dependence on China is really something that FIIA tries to look into more detail in the future, and we already started with the project. And I think the question raised in the chat is a very relevant one. It will be interesting to see if China follows a similar approach to the US in terms of extraterritorial effects on European companies, and that would really put European companies between a rock and a hard place between the US and China. So I think when we look at the whole question with China and the geo-economic competition and the challenge that the EU is facing, I think there are two dimensions to it in the moment that also affect sanctions policy. One dimension is the political dimension and the question of cohesion among European member states. So the ability to still unanimously decide on issues such as sanctions, or diplomatic sanctions towards China when it comes to violation of human rights, for example. And here we see in recent years a growing political influence from the side of China. We have the 17+1 initiative from China targeting Central European states, mainly Eastern and Central European states. And this is the political challenge. So is the EU capable in the future to speak with one voice in the international arena? And that brings us back to the earlier discussion of qualified majority voting, and if we need to find ways to derogate from this need to always speak with a unanimous voice, or if we sometimes can act also with qualified majority. But this is a very sensitive issue, as we already discussed. The second question is the question of economic dependency towards China. So not the political side, but really does the EU have still the right business environment, the right strategic industries to act and to secure the well-being of its citizens independent from China. And here we see, especially since the COVID-19 crisis, but already before, when we look at the new competition policy, for example, that the Commission put forward, some initiatives on the EU side to diversify supply chains, for example, to bolster some industries in strategic sectors, and that is very much part of the whole economic debate in the EU going on right now. I think in terms of sanctions policy, I think what was beneficial for the EU in the past was that its sanctions policy was embedded in a multilateral framework, especially when we look at the Iran sanctions, for example. They were closely coordinated with the US partners, but also in the UN and with China and Russia. And that really was the key part to its success. So for the EU to have a successful sanctions policy means to support multilateralism as well and to strengthen those multilateral ties. And I think this is the best way forward within this geo-economic competition. I think I give the word now to Ville, because I think this is a good turn towards the question of the future of US sanctions policy, especially after the election coming up later this year in the US.
Thanks very much, Nicholas. Can you all hear me? All right, perfect. I'm a research fellow at the Center on US Politics and Power at FIIA, and also obviously part of the report team. I wish I had a crystal ball, to be honest. I mean, it's really up in the air when it comes to the future of US sanctions policy. One way to look at the Trump administration or the Trump era is to think of it as a laboratory of sorts. I mean, the US has now shown that it can indeed, through the extraterritorial application of its own sanctions, force other actors in the international arena to walk the American line, so to speak. And this has been most clear in the case of Iran. So it's not sort of abundantly clear that even if we had a changing of the guard in the White House, that we would actually have a completely different approach to sanctions, you know, the sort of no return to the status quo ante. And there's a few reasons for this. One is the issue of great power competition that has already been discussed at length. And there's a bilateral consensus emerging in Washington about the need for the US to play a tougher game, so to speak. A more multilateral approach during Biden probably yes, but it's unclear to what extent. Specifically when it comes to Iran, especially in light of the events earlier this year, I mean, it's really difficult to see a rapid shift in US policies, even though if there's a change in the White House, because there's, of course, political dynamics at work in Washington that kind of militate against this kind of a quick shift in US policy. The same with regard to Russia, especially. It was already mentioned earlier that there is a bipartisan consensus. This is one of the few issues where there is a bipartisan consensus on playing tough with Russia. And of course, if the White House wanted, a Biden White House wanted to do some sort of a course correction when it comes to the question of Russia's sanctions, then this would have to fly on Capitol Hill as well. I think that's the extent that I can sort of look into the future at the current time. Thanks very much.
We could now, thank you, Ville, Niklas, and I think we could next go to Clara to answer the question on the due process, and then we have a question from Julius Seidenader relating to the changes in the commission structures, which perhaps Juha, Jokela, I don't know if you could take that question. But now over to Clara, please.
Thank you very much. So I will be quick because I'm mindful of the time. So basically, the question of due process has consumed all the oxygen in the room for quite a while. It has been one of the main priorities, if not the main priority of the Council, and it has improved a lot. So basically, my concern is not that due process is going to be a major problem in future. I'm actually much more concerned about the fact that there is so much focus on that specific question that very little attention has been paid to other issues or is being paid to other issues. But I mean, of course, this is an important consideration. It will continue to be an important consideration. I wonder whether I could address very briefly the question by Julius Seidenader. I think that the fact that, okay, thank you. The fact that the Commission has recovered the sanctions unit and transferred it to FISMA is actually a clear sign that the EU is taking implementation and enforcement very seriously. So it is, I mean, it has also negative consequences because it removes well, basically it removes sanctions a little bit from the realm of foreign policy or from the preserve of the External Action Service, but it heralds a clear focus on implementation. And finally, I have a very brief comment on the question of Brexit and what the how independent UK sanctions policy will be. I think that there is no risk of an independent UK sanctions policy that is completely out of step with everybody else's. I think that the question is whether the UK is going to align primarily with the US or it is going to align primarily with the EU and within the EU, obviously with its privileged partners, which are London and Brussels. Berlin and Brussels. Berlin and Paris. So the France and Germany, basically. And there's also another dimension to it that has not been discussed much, which is what is going to happen with those countries that traditionally align with EU sanctions policy, such as Iceland, Norway, and obviously the accession candidates. Is there going to be a competition between the UK and the EU for the alignment of these countries? So in case that UK sanctions policy diverges from EU sanctions policy in order to be more closely aligned with Washington, this might actually create a dilemma for these countries that might contemplate switching, let's say, to another side. Okay, thank you very much, and sorry for taking a little bit of extra time.
No, thank you, Clara. Very good comments, and also covering Julius Seidenader's question. I don't know if I will for the last time give floor to Juha Jokela for any comments, and if anybody from the panel wants to have the floor, you can obviously let me know in the chat box, but because we have only a couple of minutes to go, so I'm aiming to end off the session. So please, Juha Jokela.
Thank you very much, Juha. Rainne. I don't have any big issues or major comments anymore. Perhaps on the just a very brief comment about the change of the sanctions part of it from the foreign policy instruments to DJ FISMA. This could also be part of the broader development where we see that the Commission is really strengthening the kind of the economic instruments at their disposal to answer also this more geo-economic world. So this is of course a question where I think we all EU researchers are very closely looking how this is developing in due course, because of course the aim has been to move away from the kind of pillar structures related to the foreign policy and then the Commission competences, but perhaps in this Commission we are seeing for potentially also for good reasons a kind of a return to certain dynamics which we know from the past. On Brexit, I think this is also what we suggest in the report, in a way, that the possibility of an independent UK sanctions policy is something which we could potentially see over a longer period of time. And of course, the UK's capacity, you know, and I mentioned also the size of the EU's market in comparison to UK markets is of course important factor here. And what Clara said, that the kind of the which directions in the Atlantic the UK will reach will be an important question. However, I think the Brexit has made us policy analysts rather cautious. If we look at the kind of the debate before the referendum, I think there was a clear debate that this is totally against the UK's economic interest and the Brexit will never take place. When the vote happened, we again have a kind of a debate that the realities will actually propel a kind of closest possible relationship with the UK. And now with the change of the government, we are seeing again a kind of a real aspiration to build a kind of more autonomous UK in several fields. And as we now know that the negotiations, of course, they have their own logic, are not proceeding, even if the first deadline is already approaching. So there are, of course, these broader questions to be discussed. And one element of those discussions is that if the UK and EU fails to agree a future relations agreement, and if the relationship then becomes more acrimonious in general, so this could have implications for other policy fields as well. So I think what many of my colleagues also follow very closely Brexit are advising, especially the people in London, is that this future relations agreement is essential, and it could be seen as a kind of starting point for deepen the relation, also in terms of foreign and security policy in the longer run. If that's failed, so then I think we might be in a situation where it will take some years to get back to the negotiation table, and then we don't know what are the implications of that risk.
Thank you, Juha, and thank you for everybody else. We are now in the end of our time, so I'm not going to give my main takeaways or more than that. That sanctions are a key instrument available for the EU and an important tool to promote compliance with international law. And if we look at the world of geopolitical, geo-economic competition, where there's a fatigue for expensive foreign military operations, for example, sanctions seem to be the most effective or one of the most effective and hence attractive tools to achieve foreign policy objectives. And for the fact that their efficiency is enhanced by the interdependence of the global economy today. So it seems therefore likely that the current active use of sanctions will continue to the foreseeable future. I'm happy that as a result of this process, we've increased the know-how in Finland and beyond about sanctions policy, managed to create some well-informed public discussion on the topic, and finally received valuable food for thought for the civil servants working with these questions. So thank you to all the participants and speakers, and with this I am concluding this webinar.